Thank you. Yes, colleagues, I'm in a happy situation that Professor Rauber and Dr. Weigel stole my thunder, so to speak, so they had such a beautiful examples of real life of how to use the PIDs and what are the benefits of the persistent identifiers. So I come a little down from the podium and talk about the national services on the practical level that we and others in Finland are providing. And I can maybe catch up the timetable a little and speak less about the theory behind the persistent identifiers. It all looked very, no, I have to use this. It all looked very, very grand and sophisticated, but I have to say that the persistent identifiers really are a very easy thing. They are just strings of characters, so you should not be intimidated with them, but to embrace them and use them where you can. That was the advice of the last presenter before me, and it's my advice: use persistent identifiers where you can. And as I'm going to explain, there is help available, and we are very interested at the National Library to hear what kinds of needs research groups and research organizations have regarding PIDs, and we are sure we can accommodate our services to new kinds of use cases. And I remind you that a persistent identifier is supposed to be persistent, and it will not stay persistent as such. It's not a Rosetta Stone that you can bury in sand and wait for 500 years and take it back, but it needs active involvement from the researcher or the research organization. So you have to bear that in mind. And also, identifiers are evolving, so if there's something that doesn't quite fit your needs just now, just let us know and we can try to do something about that. So very basically, a persistent identifier identifies a resource or gives an identity to a resource. And there are different kinds of persistent identifier regimes. There are DOIs, that has been mentioned many times, there are URNs and so on. And I wouldn't say there's good or bad persistent identifiers around. They are usually pretty good, and we have never felt that we should promote one over the other. So there are many factors why someone would like to use some regime rather than another. And resource, as you have also heard today, can be pretty much anything. So there's no need to discuss about that here. The important thing, of course, is that whatever resource is that gets a persistent identifier should be persistent too in two ways. It should be available and it should remain the same. So people sometimes come to us and ask that, can we get a PID to a, let's say, web page? It's a web page where you can see the current weather. Well, it doesn't make sense, so it's something else. So PIDs are for stable information. And persistent identifier identifies a resource, and that's of course important that you can differentiate between two resources. Little is talked here about the thing that information, the same data can be available in two different places. Maybe that's not so common in research data environment, but it's very usual when we talk about publications. So that's very useful to tell apart and also to easily identify two information resources as the same resource. And as I said, a PID as such is a string, so it's not much, it's characters, but on basis of that string you can do different kinds of things and provide different kinds of services to the users. One important side step here, identifiers are names and they are not addresses, and this is very important in that don't rely too much on addresses because they are not names And there's been a lot of confusion around with the concept of URI. That can be a name, and it can be an address, and it can be an identifier, and no one really knows what it should be. But simple and resilient and persistent URLs are a great thing. So you should also aim to have good persistent URLs. But that's different from having a persistent identifier, because you need a good URL for that page where you can see the current weather. The information is supposed to change. It's a mistake if it doesn't change there. And it's important that that address too is good, but that's a different question and a different problem. And there's a separate problem of actually persistently identifying the stable pieces of information. So, and the application is one of the issues you can't solve with URLs, so you can only point to one place with them. And then the handovers. If www.example.com wants to send, it discontinues, and everything it has got has to be sent somewhere else. So the fine persistent URLs will not be so persistent anymore. So a good identifier and all the offerings on the market today, I think, fulfill these requirements. Are globally unique, they are persistent, and they are actionable. And as I said, it's an important thing that also the information resource they identify stays stable and persistent. And what we need to be globally unique, we need standards, obviously, but standards will always go only so far. So we need the good practices. We apply to the rules of the standards, and we have the infrastructures that we need to provide the related services. I will say a few words about two identifier regimes that relates to persons and organizations, because these are very important and perhaps even more difficult cases, at least the organizations, than the actual data object and so on. So ORCIDs were mentioned just previously, and you probably know what they are, and I hope the Finnish colleagues know that the CSC, the Center of Scientific Computing, is now heading the implementation of the ORCID identifiers in Finland, so they will give support and promotion and so on. Of course, it always comes down to the research organizations to really do the hard work, and it always comes down to the individual researcher to give the assent to the fact that they are assigned an ORCID, because the data, the personal data, will travel across the EU borders, so there need be an assent to that. But what it gives to the researcher is a unique identifier, and there are many namesakes in Finland and around the world, for example, and it also gives the researcher a sort of presence on the web, so that you get your ORCID website, which is very handy often to familiarize with someone you have met, for example. So, and we can tell that this Toni Virtanen is not the Toni Virtanen the Finnish colleagues will know. So, so that's what the ORCID does. ORCID is for researchers, and because you need the assent, it's for the living researchers only. So we have the international standard name identifier that sort of complements ORCID in that it comes more from the publication industry and music industry. So the musicians and writers and people like that already usually have ISNIs. We are now implementing it in a more large-scale manner at the National Library, so we are going to give an ISNI to everyone who is in our authority records. I don't know if authority control is a term familiar to people around outside libraries, it sounds very fancy. Authority control, we control authorities, which means that we think about how the different ways the names of people are written, and we combine them, and we know other ways you can name the Bible, which is basically the same book, although there are many different titles to it, and so on. So the ISNIs will be there complementing the ORCIDs, and ISNIs can also be assigned to organizations, and this is a very important aspect. There doesn't seem to be very much organization identifiers around. There is some kind of system in the Anglo-Saxon world, but it is on a commercial basis, so not really. And there's just one example of what the authority control does and why the name of an author is not always so handy identifier for a person. So this is Tove Jansson, written in several ways around the world. So DOIS has been mentioned several times, and the digital object identifier is really the standard identifier, I would say, in scientific publishing. And unfortunately, that also means that many supporting services only recognize DOIs as identifiers of things, and that should not be so. And we are working on making people aware that there are other identifiers than DOIs. There are, I will talk a little about URNs, but there are even other systems, and I think these kinds of services online should be really ignorant about what kind of persistent identifiers are being used. And because it's so very typical for scientific publishing, even the scientific writers nowadays expect that when they publish they get a DOI for their article, and the Federation of Finnish Learned Societies is now implementing the use of DOIs in their platform, so that basically in almost all Finnish scientific publications the articles will be assigned a DOI in the near future. It costs a little, but not very much, so it's not really a game breaker. And you need a registration agency which then helps you to really giving the DOIs and gives you the DOI numbers you need. And then there's the URN, the Uniform Resource Name, which is a sort of URI that identifies a resource by name in a particular namespace. And namespaces are standards that are created to give things identifiers. So URN in itself doesn't have a namespace, but it exploits other already existing namespaces. For example, ISBNs have been around as long as I have, almost 50 years. So they were there long before computers were a really important thing. And you have all seen ISBNs, they look like that, and you can very easily make a persistent identifier out of an ISBN, International Standard Book Number, by just adding the URN in front of it. And then by making it to an HTTP URI, you can get a persistent address, that's an URL based on the URN identifier. And there are other registered namespaces like ISSN and others available in the URN system. And national libraries and National Library of Finland are pretty much like taking care of the URN system at the moment. And there's a special case of namespace called NBN that's governed by the national libraries, and it's a very flexible tool. We can use it as we will, as we want. I don't know if I should say that an NBN comes from National Bibliographic Number. Forget it. It doesn't mean that there needs to be a bibliography or anything like that. So NBN, if you have identifier needs and you don't want to use DOIs, just contact us and we can easily give you your own NBN sub-namespace. I have here an example from the University of Jyväskylä, and basically the University of Jyväskylä can then create the identifiers as they please within that namespace. There are no strict rules how to do that, as long as they take the responsibility of them being unique. And you can even access an URN generator online, and you can pick up a URN, but of course that URN would be very useless because it has not been registered. So that's what's the next step. We have the resolving service that knows that this URN actually has the resource has URL like this. And if you assign a URN, the URN.fi service must know this URL, and that's the registration. And we usually expect that the organizations that use URNs do this automatically, so that they produce an XML file and some other methods available for us to harvest, so that we can maintain the information in the URN resolver. We strongly discourage any manual processes here because they are so error prone. We have one customer who uses manual updates, and it's the National Auditing Authority, Valtiontalouden tarkastusvirasto. So they are only one who are trustworthy enough to do that manually, but they are very strict people there. We are developing our services. We have funding them from the ATT, and we are doing some better documentation, better guidance, and so on. We are doing some sort of work with a technological background. It is very robust and resilient at the moment, and our URN resolver only contains a few dozen lines of code, so it's very simple. And that also means that the services are very simple, so it basically just redirects the inquiries to the correct URL. And we are thinking at the moment about what are the next steps in matter of services. But if you need persistent identifiers, please contact me. And we want to keep our resolution service resilient and well managed, and we want to improve our services. And it's still a bit of a new thing, but the important thing of the PIDs, one of them is that it should be there through the whole life cycle of the information. So we, to some extent, the National Library post festum gives things URNs, but it's not really that useful. It should be there, it should be embedded as far as possible in the information and so on. So it should be part of the data management from the day zero. So that's what we try to do, and we try to make it as easy as possible to everyone, and make more services, like instead of getting the URL, you might want to have the metadata. And there are many questions here too. For example, the difference between machines and humans. For a human, the splash page, landing page, is a good thing. For machine, not so much, because they might want to have the actual resource. But we heard that you can also have a machine-readable landing page, so that's something we must definitely look at. And pizza strings, they don't run out, so you don't have to be frugal with them. That sometimes happens that people are wary of giving PIDs because they think they are sort of expensive. They are not. Even the DOIs are not really expensive, even if they cost something. And the most important things about this document, it's persistent identifier is here, and my persistent identifier is there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for a very informative presentation. all these PID system vertical. So questions? Oh, where is the? Oh, I have the mic. Is this on? Okay, it's on. So questions?
I very much enjoyed your presentation and kind of the subdivision that you did. There was one item where I would probably slightly disagree when you gave the example of assigning a PID to something that's changing, such as you quoted the example of a web page, saying, you know, assigning a PID to a web page
yes, I was
that obviously is outside of the control of the thing and changes continuously. I'm not sure whether that holds as strictly, because if you assign an orchid to you as a person or to me as a person, I change as well. My competences, skills, I build up, degrade, whatever. So things change, and identifier identifies an intellectual object that is static in you always being you as a person, although you change. So the thing where that comes has an impact is when we are doing data citation, we assign a persistent identifier to the static subset that should not change, that should be identical no matter what happens to the data, but that would point in our recommendations via another PID to the intellectual object of the database as such, which obviously will change. So they're pointing, so the database changes as a database, but it doesn't change becoming a completely different database. So it stays the same as you as a person stays the same, but you evolve and the database evolve. So I think we need to differentiate between those two types of usages of an identifier, where the object that you identify will always be static, but the representation might differ.
Yes, I appreciate the point, and we have been talking about it quite a lot. And I just have the idea that seeing a persistent identifier, you should have some kind of idea what is this about. So maybe we should have another kind of identifier for those use cases or something like that. I don't know.
Not another one.
because that's sort of a problem with the URIs, that nowadays you don't really know if they are supposed to represent the same thing or something different. So
there is in the URN system there is a simple solution to the problem that you have been discussing, because in different namespaces you can have different rules for what can be identified. So for instance, in URN ISSN, the identifier identifies the entire periodical, which keeps on changing all the time, and it is perfectly all right from the ISSN point of view. Whereas with ISBN, you can only identify, say, hardcover book with the ISBN, and there are very precise rules when you have to assign a new ISBN to the same book if it changes a little. Unfortunately, in Handle and DOI system, it is anybody's guess which kind of rules have been applied when the DOI or Handle was assigned. So the document may be stable or it may not be stable, depending on what the rule behind is. But you can't really tell in those systems unless the organization that has registered the prefix has made it clear how they assign the identifiers.
I'm trying to formulate the question. I'm not sure if I can, but these different PID spaces and the kind of the development of data citation mechanisms, are these somehow also gone now that you are not, I mean, so, I mean, the choice of your, I don't know how to formulate this, but I mean, that these are somehow kind of independent decisions, what kind of, what PID system you are using and what kind of a data citation mechanism you are. Okay, many.
Someone else wants to answer that. So
you were the first one.
Yeah, the thing which came into my mind is the challenge which I've been following a bit inside the discussion in RDA is what is a digital object in itself, which is a sort of an eternal discussion which has not converged. And if I understood what you were trying to formulate in a way, is this, it's very loosely defined, the digital object first. And what I was already asking earlier, that the problem is that we end up most likely with a system where we have digital objects which are of very different granularity, and how do we sort of how do we refer to them in a unified system? I mean, basically two things. But you are the expert, or somebody else, I don't know. But these are just following it from the discussion in RDA.
Okay, one more comment, and then we'll move to the new topic.
This issue of which PID system to pick has been discussed a lot, but the only country that has created some support for this, as far as I know, is the Netherlands, where they have established a bit guide that has a set of 25 questions, and then when you have answered them, the system tells you which PID system is the best choice for you. And of course, when I filled it, the system told me that Handle is my favorite, which is somewhat embarrassing after having promoted URNs for 20 years. The definition of digital object, especially from identifier point of view, is, I would say it's impossible if you try to embrace the whole world. Again, in the URN system, the definition of objects that can be identified is a namespace specific thing. So the problem can be divided in manageable bits. But at least, in my opinion, so far RDA hasn't come up with the definition of digital object that would be acceptable everywhere.
Okay, so thanks to everyone. We are